Welcome to the ESL quarterfinal, everyone. Congratulations to all teams on getting here. My name is Josh. I'll be the chair. With me are Ari, Alon, Ross, and Ruby. My preferred gender pronoun is he. Mr. Speaker is fine. So before we get started, let's go around and get everyone's preferred gender pronouns. Belgrade A.
George is speaking first he, Maria second she.
Emilia is speaking first she, and then Tara is speaking second he.
Tel Aviv.
Ayal speaking first he, then second no words.
And Mannheim.
Rob speaking first he.
Yeah, sorry, the second.
Please silence your phones.
Yeah, that's second and then the other.
Let's shut the door. Please either come in or you shut the door, please. You can get the front door behind you. Okay. Are all the teams ready? Great. Then I call this house to order and call upon the Prime Minister. Here, here.
Ako preteraš reći ću ono pozdrav.
Can you speak up? Now, for too long, we've seen our fellow inhabitants of this planet suffering for something that is not a priority in our life. For too long, we've seen animals being tortured and being humiliated. And the right to a dignified life is something we believe that every sentient being should have on this planet. Now, animals who have this sentience, which is like beyond reproach, basically that means that they can feel pain, either psychological or physical, and that they can suffer a lot from something that is like a very, very, very bad environment of growth, a very bad environment of evolving them, and they can also feel love and connection with other animals. We think that we're making their lives by industrial farming and by many other things which are like less harmful, but still it destroys lives. Basically, we think that this is something we should battle against. Now, what do we mean as a state? Why do we need to do so? And how is this the best way? And when it comes to what a state should imply moral choices to its citizens, right? We see that a state should do the following. It should ensure that their citizens are basically making informed choices. This is an informed moral choice. Now, that is the main problem of this debate, because people feel that if they eat meat, they're making a lifestyle choice, right? That they're making a choice whether that food has more protein, whether it's like more tasty or less tasty. Now, this is not it. This is a moral choice, and it should be clarification.
Does this also apply, say, to organically farmed, ethically farmed meat?
Yes, but this is the thing. We think that ethically farmed meat also shouldn't be in this model. We think that any sort of killing of animals is bad. We are against any sort of killing of animals. Even if they have a dignified life and they kill them off for food, we are against that as well. So we have a very clear-cut case here. Now, here's the thing. We say that these sort of things are harmful because they're harming someone that we shouldn't harm. But more importantly than that, people still think that this is not a moral choice. That's why we should inform it. We are not robbing people of choice. That's what we would do if we would like have some sort of legislation, which we don't think that we can because we don't have democratic consent for it. But we think that in the long run, we can get democratic consent if people start to believe more in the ideals that we are proposing. Now, you'll hear 4 things from me on this. Firstly, the feeling of positive social identity. Everybody wants to feel good about his actions or her actions. Now, what do we mean by that? Now, if I do something in my life, I want to feel good about it. I want to think that I'm a good human being. Even Al Capone wrote that he only wants to make the world smile, right? That's why we believe that every human being deep down wants to be a good person. Now, if we impose a moral choice on these human beings, we believe that a lot of them, a huge percentage of them, will actually choose rightly. It will choose not to eat food that actually actively destroys other beings. We think that this is a choice they haven't been faced so far. But secondly, there is something called a collective action problem, right? There's like a lot of causes today, and people just fail to recognize them, they fail to become a part of them. Like, for example, a cause for global warming, right? My next 2 points are basically a parallel analysis of that. When it comes to collective action problem, what do people really mean? Now, for example, when I'm choosing whether I'm going to buy meat or not, in the status quo, I'm like, well, I know that animals are dying, if I am an informed voter, but still no one is basically doing what I want to do, like try to eat a vegetarian, try to be a vegan. So basically I'm not changing a lot, right? So this problem is a problem of agency in terms of I will not harm myself, I will not devoid myself of these small benefits, because I know that in the long run it will not make any difference. That on the grand scale I'm just a drop in the ocean. Now how do we change this by imposing this policy? Now, Mr. Speaker, you have these images all over the place. Now it is in the public discourse. Now it is in your local convenience store. Now it is everywhere. And if you want to make this small choice, no thank you, then you know that you can make a difference because the image that gets presented to you is that a lot of people now is making this small choice as well as you. So you get to believe that perhaps this is not a lost cause because now it is much more present. But more importantly, thirdly, when we don't care about issues like global warming is, no thank you, is because another reason for that is basically we don't believe that they're like real victims of it, right? And even if they are, they're pretty much far away from us. We see that now people will become aware of the fact that these victims exist and they will be able, due to these images, to have sort of emotional connections with these living beings. That is something that is like utterly natural and instinctive. So we believe that they will be able to identify with this pain, and this is something that is very important. No thank you. But another point here, which we think is rather important, is like my fourth point, is basically that the consequences of their actions are far away from these people. We want these consequences to be in front of their faces. So they're pretty much aware that the choice they're making is not only immoral and is not only harmful, but creates real life consequences. And why will this mechanism work, especially in terms of animals? No thank you. Here's why. Because we have a huge contradiction when people communicate with animals, right? We have a huge contradiction of how do we respect our animals. We love our pets, right? We think that pets are basically family. Everyone who has a pet will say this to you. Moreover, we believe that we will communicate positively with many animals which are not our pets, which are like wild animals. We respect them. We even like them. But when it comes to food, once you get like a piece of meat in front of you, you get detached from the consequences of this choice. Another example, which will maybe clarify this a bit further, is when people don't want to eat a fish if it has a head. It means that people become aware that it was a living being that had a head, and it had a consciousness, and it had like a meaningful life in its own terms, right? And now that animal basically gets devoid of all that because I want to eat food. Now we believe that people will not only choose this because it's a moral thing to do, because that is something that will make them feel good about themselves, but also they will make this choice because it's going to be a rather easy one. How so? Because they will just evaluate preferences. They're going to say, okay, is it fair for me to just be a little bit more happy and eat this meat if there's like a disproportionate pain on another being which I can empathize with for that. We believe that people, because it's a very clear moral choice, will go on our side. We think that's very important. Now, lastly, and that is something that probably will be expanded later on in this debate, here's why PETA extremism and these images will be less off of this like bad ways of fighting for these causes when we impose these things. Now, we see that these extremist images and extremist ways in which people try to make things comes from the fact that they're frustrated and that nobody cares about this problem for the reasons I've explained eloquently, hopefully. But the thing is that now you don't have the same incentive to be as extreme because you have a much more meaningful strategy. More on that later. But for all these reasons, we beg you to impose something that will be an informed moral choice of human beings. Thank
killing animals is not necessarily immoral. Second, will this actually stop people from eating animals, or will it just desensitize them and normalize animal suffering? Third point, how this loses legitimacy for the cause of animal fighting in the long run by doing so. First, a few points of rebuttal to the earlier speaker. The case that they bring us is saying, we generally think it's bad that animals are tortured and humiliated, etc. We generally agree with that, but we'd have to assume that this debate is playing out in the concept of a Western liberal democracy where there are rules and laws against torture and all of this already. So those harms and the portrayal that they paint of how we treat animals is necessarily already dictated and governed by law, and that's not the case that we should be discussing. What we're also trying to say on the other side, as Pat brings out in this bit of information, is that the differences in meat production in itself, which they will not account for in the policy that they brought forward. The fact that it's organically farmed meat, the fact that you cannot keep chickens in cages when you put hens out there anymore, when you laying eggs, I guess you say in English, that's the way you put it. That causes a lot of harm, but they wouldn't in any way in their policy distinguish between the difference of sufferings that they would bring about in the policy. We want a clarification on that, because at this point you're categorising it all and not taking in the full nuance of how animal production takes part. Okay, so what we hear from the earlier speakers, animals feel pain, they feel love, they feel connection, and this is harmed by industrial farming. Okay, well our response to that is we're saying, we're okay with reducing the pain that already happens, but we're saying in your policy it would happen even more. But our general line is killing itself of an animal is not a necessarily moral act. It's the harming of an animal during the point which is still alive. That's where the immorality takes place. And your case does not deal with that actual harm, but just places an immoral tag on the actual killing. The immorality is the harm that you put to them in the actual case. What we're bringing today on the opposition side is generally showing that your policy will just enforce the harms during the actual life and not reduce them, and reduce the general fighting to improve the lives of these animals during the actual living. Two premises in the entire case. One is that people already don't know that animals suffer, but if they were ever given any information, that they would react on it and necessarily stop eating meat. What I'm going to go through today is why it would necessarily be the case. Because first issue then, why not all meat consumption is bad and all killing animals are bad? We're generally saying here, as Peter Singer's idea of ethics, that it's not necessarily harmful to kill a being. It's not necessarily harmful in the act of killing. It's only if you deprive that creature or that being of the possibility to shape a future or to shape goals or take away the possibility of shaping the actual ideas. What we see with the most animals, yes, they have an impression of reality. They do interpret that reality, but they do not shape goals or complex ideas or interaction patterns in the same way in the long run. So not necessarily taking anything away from them in the act of killing. What we do recognize though is a case of government saying that they do feel pain, they do feel harm, they do feel other things in real life. We recognize that. What we do say in response to that is that your policy does not necessarily deal with that, because you'd still have animal farming, you'd still have the same sort of production, you wouldn't shift it in any way, but you'd still be able to increase its harm. Why would this necessarily happen? What we're saying right now is what would happen then if people generally see a sign of a suffering animal on a can of meat or package of meat, that they would say. Okay, I think first, most people know that animals are industrially farmed, but let's assume they don't know, so this would be a revelation for them. They just find out like, wow, animals are actually suffering in order for me to get food. What will happen in that case? We're saying some people might be outraged at the first start, that's pretty sure. But we've seen many things when people do get outraged. When they see pictures of famine, when they see pictures of war, when they see pictures of brutal rape in war zones, people are a bit outraged. But does that necessarily lead to engagement? That's a mechanism that opening God has not provided to us in any way. We say people might, to a certain degree, be outraged. Some of them might not buy, but we do say that a great share of them will not translate that into action as we've seen in other cases in real life. What we believe though is more probable in the long run that you normalise the idea of animal suffering. It becomes this thing that's just a constant presence in your surroundings. Every time you go into a shop, you just generally see that it's suffering there, and it becomes a normalised image just as we've done in other cases. What do we think is problematic with this then? First, that their case doesn't even account for the complexity of how different levels of suffering take place. If you've locked your chicken into a cage and never let it out at any time to warp eggs and be fed steroids and antibiotics, or if you organically farmed the chicken on the other sense. So even if they would react, assume the best interpretation of opening God, we don't necessarily know that they would react in the case of taking on the best consumption patterns after that. They might react, and not why, we haven't seen the mechanism, but even even if they would continue on, you don't know if the continued consumption would be steered in a positive direction, as you do not yourself even provide the option for them in the best case that you can make an interpretation of what you do. But even if they stop, what do we generally think would happen in the long run? Maybe that if you decide to stop, that decision should be subjected to rational reason, not by being guilt-tripped into taking a decision and forced upon it. I hate to do a backlash argument, but I'm about to start with one. What do we generally see? People have strong cultural patterns to their food, to their behaviours, and it's adapted and ingrained in we come from Croatia, we eat meat. For example, we do think if you provide that as something, I'm going to moralise every time you're going to have something to eat, which you generally enjoy, which is generally nutritious for you, but you should feel bad. I do believe a lot of people would react and would not take that positive. I'll take closing.
Do you agree that labels on cigarettes presenting, for example, dead fetuses or this cause abortions or things like that, do cause people to enjoy cigarettes less?
I think if you enjoy the taste of cigarettes and nicotine, you probably enjoy them equally much. So people might be outraged the first time they come out, but then they get over it, and people still smoke as much after the implementation of those as I said before. So yeah. Okay, but generally, backlash. So what happens? We generally believe that people have strong cultural ties to their food. As nutrition, it's generally reasonable to eat a certain amount of meat. If you feel that this is being pushed upon you, that you are being moralized and being told that you're a bad person, I think a lot of people would naturally just consume more meat. They wouldn't stop eating meat or any degree in any sense. And they feel solely be de-aligned from the movements and working for animal conditions. They see them as these moralizing institutions that are not connected to reality. They're trying to push their own morality upon them. What this generally means is that people are less likely to engage in this movement. What this generally means in a practical aspect, if you have less movement lobbying for the animal rights, that means that there will still be industrial reform. The harm that we say is the actual problem will continue to the same degree. And even if we set out the metric of stopping to kill, you haven't provided us the mechanism of where that would happen, and therefore we're very happy to oppose.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, about the moral act. Now, the first opposition comes up and gives us a lot of the complexities that come with the morale, on how it's not the same moral act to kill animal or moral act to see animals suffering or to make animals suffer. We do agree that there are differentiations between the guiltiness of your actions towards animals. But what we do see from the side of the government that we do not support any of it. Simply said, we do not support killing of animals, we do not support animal suffering, and there's a great value behind it because we believe in a better society where every living creature is treated better. And by that treatment, you get better society by bleed over of those kind of civilizational actions on the humanitarian actions that translate to your general behavior towards other people. But let me do the rebuttal of the argument they presented us with. Now, they're saying that the act of killing does not necessarily have to be immoral because it's more how you treat the animal when you kill it, and sometimes it's a necessity. The answer to this is that yes, it is a moral act. Why? Because there's a huge contradiction between what you do to the animal, what animal suffers from, like losing a life, and your own pleasure. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we do not need meat to survive. We do not need to eat meat in order to survive, so we believe that this is a big disparity between the actual consequences that the animals suffer and what we gain in return. The second part of the repetition of the moral act is, the biggest issue with this is that most people actually don't kill this animal. They're detached from taking the life away. They're detached from the production of food, the ways that animals are treated. They close their eyes towards what animals are suffering from, and in that order we have a necessity to present them with their own actions and the moral casualties of those actions. So in this order, yes, the state is saying to their people, you're being a bad person, and we completely support that, because they actually are being that way, but because of the system allowing them to close their eyes and to detach themselves from their own actions, we need to remind them of that. Now, the second part of the refutation is about the engagement part. Now, they say even if you make people see these pictures and give them more information, they would necessarily not be engaged in these actions in order to change their behavior. Couple of answers to this. First of all, this is not Syria. Basically, if you want to get engaged in a conflict in Syria, you need to become an activist. You need to become much more invested in the conflict in order for your actions to actually have some meaning. Here, the state is giving you on your plate the information and an easy choice to make. It might not be easy for you. Now, this is the other part of the refutation. We never said that every single person will make a choice not to eat animals, because we as a state cannot make people do things they do not want to do. We as a state cannot make laws that will not be supported by citizens, because this is something that we do see is a big difference towards the cultural background that we had for many, many years. What we can do as a state, inform our citizens and provide them a moral choice to make. Now, a lot of people will still stick to their guns. They will say, this is my cultural thing, I'm from Texas, I like meat. So basically, we do see that part of citizens. But a lot of citizens actually don't have, never have this choice on the table in front of them. A lot of citizens are eating meat because that's just a thing people do. A lot of citizens, on the other hand, as Georgia has provided you with answers, are not actually keen on torturing animals. They go to a restaurant, they eat fish, but they ask the chef to take the head away. They go to a restaurant to eat meat, but when they see rabbit on the menu, they go crazy and they walk out of the restaurant. We see this dichotomy that is contradictory. So we do believe that a lot of people are engaging in meat eating, killing of animals, suffering of animals, because the companies allow them to detach from their choice. The companies put the blindfold on their eyes because they're not the part of the production process to actually see what are they doing. But they're sending us signals with their behavior and with their support of animal rights movements and stuff like that, that they do actually care. So we want to see where they're at. Now, going to my substantive. Going through the companies on one more point in my substantive, in how they actually achieve to make such a blindfolded choice for us. They're selling us a lifestyle, as Georgia has explained to you, by not actually saying what they are selling. But on the other hand, companies have a monopoly over production. Dear Mr. Speaker, you have to realize that a lot of people in this world don't have enough money. In order for them to survive, they do have to buy industrial farming food because it offers a lower price. So if they're detached from their moral choice, if they blindfold their eyes in front of the choice and actual casualty toward animals, it's much easier for them to say, well, I have to survive, this is much cheaper. But, just a second. But if we do this, it will actually be much harder for them to make such a 1 + 1 = 2 choice, because they see it's not that simple. Yes?
So you're saying poor people who are now financially pressured into buying those products should feel a lot worse about this economically forced decision?
No, I say they will have to eat less meat. Or not eat meat at all, because there are other produce that are cheap and can provide them with even more healthier lifestyle. That's the easy answer. Now, the second part of my argumentation is about the fact that yes, we do believe when the side of the government comes up and says that eco-farming is far better choice, and we see them on our side of the government. Why? Because when people see how much industrial farming is hurting animals, the people who don't want to stop meat will much easily go to the farmed produce, because it's a more moral obliged choice, a much more rewarded moral choice. Now, going to the extremism. Now in the society, you have people who are actually fighting for their animal rights. And as Georgia has explained to you in his speech, but I will add just one sentence, now the game will be much more leveled. You will have a moral discussion in the society that will not be as extreme. Far less people will backlash from this. For all these reasons, we beg
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister. Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
So as a vegan, let's pretend for 7 minutes I'm proud to oppose. There are 3 ideas to talk about. So first of all, this won't reduce meat consumption. Second of all, that makes a type of coercive decision that we shouldn't respect, and it's not our duty towards our citizens. Thirdly, how this reduces less harmful options and therefore defeats the purpose of your policy. Fourthly, because it undermines political capital. We disagree with your characterization. We're not saying there are different degrees. What we're saying is killing is not bad at all, whereas harms is terrible. We think that's morally consistent. Why? Because if you look into Peter Singerian ethics and a lot of utilitarian ethics, you would say that losing a life in itself is not a harm. We treat people differently and animals differently upon their logical capacities. That's why often we think abortions are completely fine. That's why in most countries people think that comatose patients should be allowed to die. That's why usually we have this idea of saying, if you have no future plans, if there's a way of killing you with as little harm as possible, you losing your life is not a harm in and by itself. The only thing we hear from them is replies, but it's bad because it's suffering. No, we disagree that losing your life is suffering in itself, particularly when you have lacked the capacity to think and plan ahead for the future because you're not losing anything. You're deprived of a meaningless state of which we're all in, and that's totally fine for those animals. Sorry, that sounds depressing. Second point. Now let's look a bit more of some rebuttal things. So they have this idea that will we eat less meat, yes or no? So first of all, they say it's not a priority. That's wrong. For most people, what we consume is one of their main characteristics. People identify by local cultures, by what they eat, by being a good cook, whatever. That's partly traditional, it's partly a skill, it's partly something that makes people socialize, get together. Now, why is that problematic? Apart from the obvious depriving of enjoyment, it means often there's a lack of knowledge involved. What you see with 19-year-old vegans who really care about those poor animals, they often forget to replace those products properly. What you want is scare people into taking meat away from their nutrition. We don't think that benefits people to a large degree. That's why you see vegans with betrothed black. That's why you see cats of vegans dying because they don't get meat, because they think that's a good thing, because no one should ever have meat. We think those are stupid narratives to enforce upon people. And that's exactly what happens with emotional bullying. That's exactly what happens when you use emotional bullying, extreme images of telling people this is so abhorrent that it cannot be justified. Also, what you ignore is that for a lot of people there's a certain necessity involved in it. A lot of those nutritions, as you point out, are very harmful, say for women on their period, say for people who lack certain vitamins, certain iron, certain protein. For them that's the easiest and, as you rightfully point out, cheapest way of getting those nutrients. And we don't see why those people should be bullied and shamed into feeling about this when they can't economically afford it, when they know that health-wise they should be doing it. You're not forcing those people, when going to the supermarket, while being perfectly aware, under most circumstances, already under the status quo that it's bad, to be constantly faced by what they're doing, by the necessity of their defeat, by the necessity of their suffering as a human that they are not so animals, while they can't properly change it, or while they value that they won't be able to change it, just because for them nutrition is so important. And you talk about cigarettes. But look what happens with cigarettes. Like people desensitized to some degree. Like when they were introduced, people would share cigarette packets from all the countries. Oh, look how funny the Polish pet LUND looks like. That's an issue for people who are being desensitized to the images by themselves. Secondly, it hasn't massively reduced smoking, even though that's something that directly affects you. Now imagine something that directly affects someone else, which is not even from your species. We think that will have a very, very limited effect, and if anything, desensitize you to the idea of animal suffering. We think that's a terrible idea, we're against that. Why is that so? Because if you look into the characteristics, which they haven't because they provide next to no policy, what we see here is that animal suffering is induced in a lot of cases. As a vegan, I'm perfectly aware that even the soy burger I'm eating means that there are small farmland animals like mice being overrun by tractors. If you want to be morally consistent, every single meat product, every single vegetable product, except for your locally farmed grandma aubergine or whatever, is most likely involving a massive amount in those companies of animal harm. Now, if I see my soy burger with crushed mice on it, which I assume is the policy you're presenting, because you're talking about direct harms of what your policy does, you should probably depict it that way, and we think that discourages people from consuming those products. Why is that bad? Because when we already established that killing is not a harm in itself and it's about reducing the harming of animals, then we look into different forms of forming nutrition for yourself. You could either eat mass-produced, mass-farmed animals under certain circumstances. We think that's terrible because it increases harms of animals. Or you could have organically grown animals. You could have more soy products. You could have other alternative products, all of which cause animal harm, all of which can be graphically depicted as causing animal harm, while being morally clearly superior. Why is that an issue? Because images can't probably show those. You've seen significant advances in, say, chicken production, where they are now gassed to death. That sounds terrible. That looks terrible on a picture, seeing a chicken being gassed to death. That is incredibly more humane than traditional methods previously being used for killing chickens. Now, if we establish that people will not massively reduce their consumption, and they will have less incentives of doing so, because they can no longer advertise their good, clean, fair trade organic chicken with those nice images on the package. Because they will be contradicted by the massively negative images that you present that will be on every single meat product, including non-meat products. That means that they no longer have a competitive advantage compared to products which objectively, morally are superior, because they reduce the harm to those people. That means the growing movement we see at the moment of people consuming more organic products that harm animals less is harm. We have less of an incentive of investing in those areas, less of ideas of improving living conditions. That's terrible. Okay.
Actually, those people that are using organic products are the one aware of their moral choices, but majority of people do not have the option to make the choice because they believe it's only a price point choice. But now they actually make a different choice.
Good. If they don't have an option to make a choice, why do you want to make them more suffering? That's already explained. Secondly, even those people who are aware of it, still those images apply, which I guess is the point of your policies. Images bypass rationality. That's part of the idea of emotional bullying that the media brings up by trying to force you into specific things that are not information-based, not rationality-based, but by things. But it also affects me as a vegan if I know that the soy burger is the better option, but I still see that crushed mice. That might be hypocritical that I won't want to see it. It might be hypocritical that I won't want to see the head of the animal. But if it means that my little hypocrisy means that overall I do the better thing, that overall I reduce the harm for people, that's beneficial. That's equally true by the backlash point. People are offended by taking away meat options at socials, at debate venues in Germany. No matter when you see those pictures in a lot of cases. That means the political platform of environmental parties, of PETA, being seen as extremists who want to push the violence upon you, of people who want to show you the fur coat stained in blood. Those are images that undermine the credibility of those organizations and their potential to affect real change in society. That's terrible.
Is that people have a moral obligation to be aware and to be informed of the moral implications of their actions. We're going to talk to you about, we're going to show you why such information can only be done through taking an emotional price from people through using this policy. Before I go, I'll have 2 points of substance, which are going to be, first of all, why specifically this kind of information is the one that we need. Second of all, why our alternatives like general information to people and general knowledge is not enough. First of all, some rebuttal. Notice, first thing, that opening opposition makes no differentiation in their case between this specific policy and general giving general information to the public about the harms of meat. Meaning everything they tell us about this undermines business. This puts a moral burden on people. All these things apply also to a 60 minutes review talking about harms to animals. We simply don't see the differentiation. So they in a way take upon themselves the burden to go against this as well. Then they tell us killing in itself is not immoral. First of all, we say to that, it does not apply to the way the market actually functions today, because we see that today you do have a huge amount of suffering in this market. Second of all, we say animals are attached to other animals. The fact that you have taken a cow from the cow, you see the cow mourning. There is suffering just in the act of killing. Third of all, we say, usually when someone kills you, that causes some degree of harm to you. And then they talk to us about desensitization of these images. We're going to answer this extensively in our substantive. Then they tell us there are a lot of different products that harm the environment, and people don't make the right contacts. We're saying, yes, we're fine with presenting all of this, and we're fine with people making their own calculation of what they deem more important. As was already mentioned by opening, we believe that the people consuming organic food are more aware consumers. These companies can explain that their methods may seem cruel, but they are actually less cruel. We're saying this specifically works, and because we increase information, people will be more willing to accept such explanations. So no. So why should we inform people specifically in this sense? What we're saying is, when you take pleasure in eating meat, when you take pleasure in a product that was produced with suffering, you actively profit from the suffering of another living being. We do not have to prove to you that this suffering is completely illegitimate. This is still an issue in dispute. It's political controversy. We're therefore not in favor of banning this. However, we say that that there is a concrete and significant harm being done, and you pay no price for it. We're saying you have to be, at the very least, aware of the moral implications of your actions. And we're saying that the state is, in this sense, has the right to actually direct behavior in a way that is deemed generally to be better. We're saying this is exactly like syntax, for example, or exactly like some cigarettes. Even though you're harming yourself, you have the full right to harm yourself. We're saying you still should be aware of the implications. So what we're saying is, and the analogy we want to take in this specific sense is a polluting factory. Why? Because we're saying a factory that pollutes the environment. Actually, we recognize that there is a value to the work of to the products produced by this factory. We're saying, however, there is also a price, there is also a damage, and so what you want to do is to create a harm that is to this factory. You make him pay a price that is equivalent to the damage it causes. We're saying, and why is this the best way possible? Because in this sense, if the price paid for this policy is higher than the profit, or the value gained from it, then you will stop doing it. If the value is greater than the price, you will continue. Sure. So why is this exactly the same? Because what we do here is we force you to reflect. We show you through an emotional picture exactly what the damage that your action causes. We make you pay the emotional price of your decision. We make you, and in a way, stand there butchering the animal yourself. We make you stand there watching that animal suffer. If that is more, if you see your value in eating meat is greater than the suffering of this animal, fine with us. You can do that. We are happy with it. However, we think you have the obligation to know what is the price. And we're saying it is fraudulent of us not to let you know this, because you may have chosen differently. If saying this animal butcher is appalling to you, we're saying this is when you have the right to know this, and you have the obligation to stop doing it. So basically what we see here is that you lead to a change in behavior that is exactly the right change, because it reflects people's actual preferences through taking an emotional toll. Why is this emotional toll so important? Why do we believe that you will not be desensitized? Why do we believe people will still feel it? Because we're saying you have your personalization of suffering. Morality, ladies and gentlemen, works through a personal image. It does not work through statistics. It does not work through general information. It works through emotions and empathy that are built in process. When you have one animal to directly associate with, this is something that creates this moral calling. We say that this will happen again and again. Second of all, this is something that's disgusting. This is something that's physically appalling to me, and this detracts from my pleasure in eating this food or using this product. This is exactly the sort of price we want to take. So this is why we believe this is the right policy. Before I go on, opening, yes.
We explained to you that it oversimplifies the process of suffering. There are different options of killing who look equally bad on picture by the very nature of picture and suffering, whereas in real life they have different qualities. How do you depict it?
I think people can, when you see this image, you can make yourself more informed on also the rational aspects. Because when something has triggered you emotionally, then you also look up the information. Then you also make the research. We think that's the more likely scenario. Now, why is our alternative not equally good? We're saying that, as was already mentioned, there is a huge cultural system that's meant to make us eat meat. But moreover, we're saying this is actually very much like fraud in the sense that we do not actually, what we see in the store is a very, very hygienic product. It does not look anything like the animal. It does not give us the right information. What we do through this is, they say desensitization, we say this works exactly like advertisements work. Why? Because it repeats the same message over and over again. This is exactly the way you got to know the notion that meat is good in the first place. This is the way we make you know, ingrain a new notion. Just like you watch Coca-Cola commercials over and over again, they say, and make you think inherently of Coca-Cola. We see the same thing happens here. After a long time of this process happening, this is exactly what happens. We balance out the worst, the bad commercials, the bad cultural ingraining that has happened so far. So what have we told you? We're showing why people have the right and the obligation to be informed of their moral decisions. Why this happens under this mechanism, we beg you to propose.
If anybody is within reach of windows, they can open. Okay. I name a member of government and a member of opposition. Here, here.
On closing opposition, we realize that you can only get real change from a top-bottom approach. We say that even if you don't have the laws and if you don't have the politics to support those kind of values that have in society, we say that real change is not possible under the current status quo. And we say, as of that, we say it's very important to have those kind of charities, to have those kind of organizations, to lobby for those things. So we're going to talk about those kind of things, those kind of charities, why they're so important for the public, public discourse, for the political discourse, and why they're the only mechanisms where we can get real change into the politics. Before that, some points of rebuttal. Basically, the one point that proposition tried to hammer this debate is they were trying to tell us that they were trying to inform people, right? And there was one huge problem with that opening already pointed out. That like the advertising and the pictures that they show does not present reality, right? It basically does not really present reality in the way that reality has many nuances that not all institutions are that bad as pointed out by those pictures. So we say that even if you want to inform those people, you can't do that because it has much more nuances to inform them wrongly, basically, right? They then tell us, the closing tells us, people have a right to know. And we say that if people are so keen on knowing that, like people can inform themselves, so like that's not a problem. But secondly, we say they never told us like we have those those organizations like PETA, like Greenpeace, who are already informing people. They never tell you why that is not enough. But thirdly, we tell you that generally people already know that animals are suffering. Like animal meat has to come from somewhere, right? So that's why we think like people are not stupid, especially in Western countries. We say people are kind of original. Thirdly, they tell us, well, images are the only way to show the kind of information. And we see like the problem with that is like we think we question the ability of images to maintain all information about the detail of suffering because of the detail of the technology. Like one image cannot really show all the stages of slaughtering of one cow, right? So it also cannot display all the suffering, all the kinds of different suffering that they want to display. So we question the fact whether those pictures can actually do the things that they want to. But secondly, we also say that it cannot show and display all the nuances that opening opposition already talked about, right? Skewing the debate in the bad way that opening opposition basically talked about. Before we move on, yeah.
Basically, the picture is simplifying it for you. It shows you the end consequence of every animal killing, every animal suffering, so you know the exact truth at the end.
Your goal is to rightfully inform people in detail so they can make fully conscious decisions. And now you say you're basically simplifying it for them and basically not showing them detail. You say that's a contradiction, we say it doesn't work in this side of the house. Right. So why do we want to talk about charities? Because we think charities are very important in order to lead the public discussion, but also to implement, or actually they have the power to implement those kind of things. Right? So how are what do campaigns and organizations, what do these campaigns and organizations actually want and what's their goal? We say those organizations aren't stupid, right? They don't want to put a blanket ban on eating or consuming animal meat, but they actually recognize that the reality is much different than that. There are some slaughtering organizations that are worse than others, and of course, basically, what they're trying to implement is like laws that make it better for those animals, like it's safer for those animals, and prevents more harm and more suffering. Right? So we say those campaigns basically like go and want to change the worst situations and worst instances and basically tackle those problems in the first place firstly. So we say that's a goal they want to get. And we think it's very much important that we have those kind of organizations in order to achieve that goal. Why can they achieve that goal? We say firstly, when you have those images, it desensitizes people, like opening opposition said. So it becomes less likely for them to engage with those kind of organizations, or like to be able to, like those images to be appealing to them, right? At the point where you see so much suffering, see so much cow suffering, so many cows dying, so many limbs being cut off, at some point the 10th limb being cut off is not as bad as the first limb being cut off. So the consequence of that is that you're less likely for these campaigns to appeal to you when you see some of them on the street. So secondly, we also say, like also when people feel like they already know the facts, right? Because opening, assuming that the policy works and assuming that mechanism works, that people feel more informed, we say it's less likely that they have interest in engaging those kind of organizations because they feel that it's not necessary anymore for those organizations to inform them because, as they tell you, they are being informed, right? And if this policy works, we say that's bad for those organizations. So why is that bad, and why, and what do the charity organizations actually do? Because we see, firstly, they lose support in terms of membership to actually have lots of helpers to campaign more people, but also they lose some more investment, right? And that investors will lose interest in putting the money into organization at the point that they realize that there are much more broader and effective ways of reaching people via like government imposition on the market. We say because of those organizations, then the organizations get less money. So let's get to the crux of this argument, right? Why are those organizations so important? Because we say that you can only truly inform people when you give them facts, when you give them information, and you only do that in hours of the house, because those organizations deliver those facts, right? Let's talk about like how politics actually work, how you implement policies. It's not like one person of us, like after I've done the decision I'm not eating meat anymore because of your images, go to a politician and tell them like, oh, I find it so bad that animals are being slaughtered, please do something about it, right? We think it requires a much more powerful organizations to actually get those kind of changes. But moreover, we think it requires information and power. So we say those organizations basically focus all of their voices in society, if society like actually wants those changes to happen. It focuses them, but also substantiates them by giving actual information, right? It's not like every person who like decides to not eat meat is going to go into the internet and get all information necessary in order to convince politicians. We say those organizations do that. They substantiate the claims of doing so and substantiate the claims of like that eating or consuming meat in general is very bad. So we said secondly also that they also need those kind of things in order for them to lobby, right? We say we need some kind of lobbying in the parliament or in politics in order to actually influence those kind of politicians. We say they only can do so because they first have the power, they have the credibility, because they're mostly bigger organizations, but also because they kind of resemble and focus all the voices from society. And so it's much more likely that politicians will listen to those kind of organizations than single people within the community. So we say it's more likely politicians will listen to them than the society, like in individual voices. We basically say that it organizes voices and it substantiates voices from society, and only then we can lead to get a top-down effect on our side of the house, and that's why we're very
Dear partners, 3 points of summation. First of all, why do we have an obligation to put the pictures on the packages? Second question, why are pictures specifically necessary and the alternatives are not sufficient? Third question, will more people actually be vegan or vegetarian versus the backlash that side opposition times to claim? 1 point of rebuttal regarding the extension we have just had. They're talking about charities, they're talking about gaining political power through them. What we've asked in POI already to first opposition, and was not answered and was not nuanced in there, is how come, if they're afraid I'm not informed right now, and I'm going to be too blunt, and I will not care about veganism, how specifically this policy is going to matter something? Because please notice, Facebook already has many pictures of specifically what they are talking about. When 60 Minutes shows us a show about specifically these things of slaughtering, already the negative things which we are talking about happen in the status quo, meaning that the entire effect of policy is actually diminished by the reality they are creating. Because we know specifically this policy is something that adds up in the calculation of actually mattering at the end, and this is actually the premise of the entire thing. So let's go to the first point of summation. Because in the first house, we've heard the idea of whether it's a moral or an immoral thing to kill animals. We've heard from OG the idea that people are not informed, that they have to be aware in order to know that they have far away victims. Then comes OO and tells us it's not necessarily immoral. Of course, we believe it is an immoral, it's an immoral thing to do. However, we think that it is not actually the thing that we have to show you in this debate of whether it's moral or immoral. It's a question of doubt. When we have enough doubt, it's okay for the government to implement this policy. Because the suffering of the animals is not something in which it is in contention in this debate. How do we know it? We actually know it by the logic of the first opposition itself, because they're telling us that there are more humane methods to actually kill the animals, meaning that suffering is something objective by their own logic in this debate. What does it actually lead in this debate? We give you 2 things in our extension here. We're telling that, first of all, on the first level, we're not actually talking about, we're not actually care about whether we're actually going to inform, we're caring about the emotional toll. This is the first thing which is crucial. How do we know that this is okay thing to do for a state? Because right now, under the status quo, the state does things like taking sin taxes on cigarettes. It doesn't mean that as a cigarette consumer, I actually know about all the effects, but we see that it actually has the power and the legitimacy to direct the behavior of the citizens that consume it, even though it is something for their own benefit. It means that we actually clash directly with OO on this point in the manner that they're talking about it, that's going to hurt the culture of the people, the people which are poor and dependent on it. We say that it is exactly the same logic that applies to cigarettes, in which we hurt the people that consume it, in which we hurt the people that are actually seen as part of their identity. If they want, they can continue, but we're trying to direct their behavior when we have the legitimacy in order to do so. So then we actually go to a deeper level. And we say that there is a difference between being informed and being emotionally informed. And emotionally informed is what we care about in this debate. What do we mean and what was not rebutted in our extension here? Because what we say right now is that we have to take a toll of people, the emotional toll. Why? First of all, if I do not know that I cause the suffering at the end, I will, as someone who tries to be moral in this world, I do not have the proper calculus in order to make my choices. And we say that knowing that something happens in a far away place is not sufficient in order to make these choices. How do we know this? This is exactly the logic of putting pictures of times of war in the paper in order for me to know that something. Moreover, we go actually again deeper in our extension. What we say is that you have to actually show and prioritize and intensify what you actually feel in order to know what you feel. You do the comparison of the idea of negative externalities that exist under the status quo when you pollute something. You cause something which is not direct to someone that does not have a voice. The state has the obligation to take these taxes from you in order to direct your behavior and show you that you're taking a toll of something. In this case specifically, because this toll is suffering, in order for you to take it, you actually have to show you that you're helping someone at the end. Second question in this debate, why are the pictures and the pictures are necessary? Because again, we give the idea that there are other ways to inform. However, we give the idea that all other ways and the product itself is a fraud to the consumer. What do we mean by that? The idea of getting the culture that exists right now in the status quo, hearing the state scissors in the pen, hearing the idea that it's actually quite a clean product. When I go to the and consume a piece of chicken, it looks so nice, I just want to eat it. I forget everything else in the world because it's so ingrained in our culture. This is why there are no valuable alternatives to specifically create the causal link that when you consume this specific product, you're making a damage to someone else. This is why we specifically need this policy, because the product itself is designed to be a fraud that makes you to forget that anything in the world happens. And this is how we answer the question to side opposition in this debate of why specifically this policy is needed there and not in the idea of the policy happening for Facebook or somewhere else first.
So people feel limited in their freedom as you force story images upon them in every supermarket. This breeds resentments that prevents them NGOs from getting majority support to enact laws later on.
No, okay. We disagree for the question in this debate and make answer to right now. So will it actually, what is going to be the actual policy? Because first of all, already given by OG in this debate, it's necessary to get to be far away. Then you say it's going to be harms to vegans, because right now I'm going to change to other methods of consuming. So first of all, we don't understand when was the last time that someone who is already a vegan or a vegetarian was actually in a meat department to see these products. But moreover, now it's a question of probabilities. Not in one speech of side opposition we have heard a valuable alternative to inform people otherwise. What we say is that the status quo is that most people do not care enough right now, but if they are in Mangrove, there is a greater chance to actually gain the political capital that we are talking about. Because if I'm a new consumer right now of meat, and I do not know what is related to it, now that I know that there is suffering that is part of it, yes, after a while there is a chance for me to get desensitized eventually. But if I know that there is a toll, it's much better than the alternative which is happening in the status quo of me to not know. Some will get too blunt about the subject, but why does it matter? Because all they want is an exposure to the relic in order for me to donate a little bit of money at the end of the month. If more people are going to be exposed to it, more people will eventually, under our model, will be able to implement the policies that they care so deeply about. We have answered three things in our extension. First of all, why emotional information is very simple. We will care about specifically that. And third of all, why will more people actually be vegan or vegetarian? The model. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor Whip, and call on the opposition to close out the debate here.
So what we hear across the whole government bench is that killing is bad without actual substantiation why it's exactly the case. What we hear in closing government is that we should make people pay for killing animals. Now let me take the whole case down with just giving you an example. Yeah, but actually an analogy. What we see in opposition, right, is that the hierarchy of nature is cruel. What we see is that we've told you from the very beginning on that killing by itself is not bad, but the way you do it. And now let me ask you, would you actually force a cat not to kill a mouse because it has feelings? We'd rather feel that is ridiculous. Now if we then go on to the government extension, right? They would pay, or if we assume you could make that happen, right? They would punish that cat equally, no matter how that cat kills the mouse. It could rip it apart just in one go, right? It could actually kill it really quickly. We think there are differences. We established that from the very beginning of the debate. And we feel that opposition side actually takes this debate just by showing you that the main problem in the government strategy is that just by putting a cruel picture on a label, you have no degree of information whatsoever how an animal was actually killed, or how animal testing was actually conducted. We think that is harmful because A, it does not make any differentiation, therefore harms companies. We feel the whole plan is harmful because it forces people to actually buy into moralities they cannot always afford. And we actually feel that, and that is what we extended upon, right? The most important part of that actually, the harm of that government policy is that we actually shift discourse away from the focus it should actually be on. Now let me therefore quickly resume this debate. I'm going to first talk about the crash why killing animals is actually not so bad, and what their policy does about the whole discourse about animal rights. Secondly, I will talk about the state, and why is it problematic to actually impose such radical morality, both on individuals but also on companies. And thirdly, I will just talk about consumer trust really quickly, but we think we actually obviously took that. Now first of all, big crash. Killing animals is bad. Like I already told you, that's a big assertion. They never showed us why you cannot actually differentiate to certain degrees. We told you across the whole government opposition bench that actually the thing that matters is how you do that. We feel that the whole chain of nature actually builds upon the idea that animals or humans eat animals, other animals eat animals. In that case, if you say that killing by itself is so bad, they could also show us why the whole chain of nature doesn't work and why all other animals should become vegetarians in that. We think that's very enlightening, right? So what we actually see, that what the actual focus of this debate should be, is you need to weigh to which degree you impose harm, and that means that actually the whole target group, or the actual focus should be upon those companies who impose extreme cruelty, right? Or extreme ways of animal testing when you create products. We see that's what the actual focus should be on. Now Khan just stood up and told you why in our world, when you don't use the pictures, you actually still have the better discourse. Because now let's firstly look at informed choices. Again, just an assumption that people are uninformed. We all know that if we go to the supermarket and buy the cheapest meat, it's most likely factory farming. Many people still do it because it's more comfortable, or simply because they cannot afford it. So we do not buy that premise that actually people are so uninformed at the moment. You can see it. You can see actually, you can go to a chicken farm, you may be shocked for a couple of minutes, you still keep on buying that food. But even if you are unaware, and that's where the big problem in the whole government policy lies, is that they do not have any differentiation, right? So you would have the equal label of how you just kill that cow on meat produced on an organic family, small family farm, as compared to factory farming. Now if we assume I, as a consumer, am uninformed, and if we buy actually the idea they just said in POI that this is a very simple way of communicating means, right? Then I, as the consumer, believes I see that label, so I'm now informed I do not have to engage with other things anymore. And that is actually what we cannot have at both ways. That was why those labels and the awareness campaigns do not work together. That's why we can only go with either way. We really told you need to go our way to actually focus discussion on what the actual really cool killings are. Why? Because even if you assume that now you might still be willing to engage in more discourse, we also gave you a lot of analysis. Right? If you see pictures everywhere, right, you wouldn't be emotionally affected by that anymore. So even if, in a second, even if PETA comes now, and even if the unlikely event happens, that I still believe those pictures don't inform me enough. I've most likely seen so many cool pictures that I will not be shocked by the PETA or Greenpeace video anymore. So I will not be more incentivized to actually make that clear differentiate call. And that is essentially why the debate falls on their side if you introduce their thought. Closing, please.
If a person chooses not to consume meat as a result of this policy, what this means is this person has been defrauded, and he does not fulfill his moral obligation, what he perceives as moral obligation. It is the state's right obligation to give him this information.
That's a perfect transition to into my next point, and so many ifs in that POI, based on the assumption that people would actually stop eating meat. We said the majority will not. We say those people who might likely do it are those who are already engaging in discourse quite a lot. Now let's talk about morality. We clashed really clearly that we do have a problem if the state imposes that morality. Firstly, because it affects people who might not be able to afford a moral standard of living. That's the person who lives on low wages, or maybe even on social welfare, who cannot afford or get super organic products or other products. You actually put a huge moral stamp saying you are immoral, and the state itself does that. Therefore, encourages other people to actually blame that person even more. While actually poor people or people who have to rely on their nutrition for health reasons cannot change it. Now, secondly, and that's the rebuttal, where the value rebuttal comes in, right? So they say we need to make you pay for the emotional price of your decision. We say that actually also means you make companies pay for the financial price of a blame and shame company. Why? If we assume their plan actually works, which we said it doesn't, right? We also assume that you will then also blame the small businesses, blame the organic family farm, right? And that's problematic, because in that case, they are the ones who will ultimately suffer even more, because the business is much smaller. So the state actually encourages those practices they want to ban those practices they want to promote, right? Because if then people blame and shame equally, that means that those industries or those production processes that should be subsidized by the state, that should be morally supported by the state, will be killed. And that's why the whole morality does not stand on their side anymore. Now lastly, in just a couple of seconds, let's talk about consumer trust and just re-establish that idea. People will still continue to buy those products in the majority of cases, such as I still continue smoking because I've not been shocked in the long term by all these pictures. I've actually started to collect them because it's quite a nice game.